You are.
Okay.
Okay, we'll be ready to go in 3, 2.
Good evening, everyone. I will now call the June meeting of the One High Point Commission in order. I'd like to start out by asking Commissioner McMichael to call the roll.
Calling the roll, Chair Joe Alston,
Here.
Courtney Austin Wilson, Brenda Dietz. Faye McCauley,
Present.
Doris Patrick,
Present.
Constance Reynolds, Janet Riley Wright,
Present.
Robert Sims, Bridget Tolliver,
Present.
Robert Williamson,
Present.
Councilman Holmes, Councilman Johnson,
Present.
and Commissioner McMichael present.
Thank you. I'd like to start out by welcoming each one of you for joining us tonight, those that are here and those that are listening to the broadcast. You're in for a treat tonight. There's going to be a wealth of information provided on where we are and how we got to this point. But before we actually get started, I'd like each one of us to observe a moment of silence. Thank you. Okay, the first thing I'd like to do tonight for our content experts is to have each one of our commissioners give us a minute of why you elected to serve on this commission. And I'll allow our facilitators to handle that.
All right. Thank you, Chairman Austin. And I, too, would like to welcome everyone to this monthly meeting of the One High Point Commission. It's been a little over a year now, or close to a year. A lot of work has been done, and as I had mentioned at the previous meeting, you all are at a point where you're beginning to see the fruits of your labor. And once the subject matter experts make their presentations tonight, you'll see some of that. You will see where we're going with this process. Before each of the commissioners shares their why or the reason that they decided to get involved in this work, I'd like you to remind us to be mindful of the time and to be courteous to our peers. Each of the commissioners will be given exactly 1 minute to explain to the subject matter experts your why and why it's important to you that you actually do this work. To stay in line with our agenda, you'll need to keep your remarks at a minute or under. And because at 6:45 promptly, we will begin the process of hearing from the subject matter experts. And I'd like to just go down the list here and have you all to go ahead and just introduce yourselves again if you choose to, but to share with the subject matter experts why you're here tonight. And we'll start with Commissioner Dietz.
Hey, good evening. I will be brief. I am involved with this commission as a lifelong resident of High Point. I have a lot of family members here. I'm very interested in continuing to see the improvements in the city. I think the city of High Point is doing a lot of great things. We want to continue to build that across the community-wide for the city of High Point. And I just want to be a part of making an effort to facilitate wonderful change for all of our citizens across High Point, all citizens.
Thank you very much. Commissioner McMichael, if you would, please.
Yes, thank you. I am a local pastor here in the city of High Point and spend a lot of my time working with a church that is 5 generations High Point, and I'm also a community activist and leader and do a lot of work around social justice. And this particular commission was an opportunity for me to not only give voice to the voiceless, but to be able to articulate the needs of our community from a grassroots level and from a place of being able to impact policy and practice at the city level in order to make sure that lifelong residents of High Point have an opportunity to have equity.
Thank you, Commissioner McMichael. We'll now hear from Commissioner Patrick. I'm sorry.
That's okay, it's quite all right. In thinking about that question, I have always been an activist. Even when I was in school, that was taught to me from my mother. And living in this city, I came expecting much better than what I received, but I had to live through it. I had to endure it for a while, and then one day I was just fed up with the disparities and the unequalness that exists in this city among the black and the white. I just decided, okay, we can work with reparation and try to get something done about it.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Raleigh Wright, please.
Good evening. Well, one of the main reasons I noticed that Commissioner Patrick said she was an activist, I believe I'm an advocate, and I believe I was a born advocate. It seems to be where I'm led no matter what I do. So for that reason, I wanted to be a part of this commission, not to necessarily be a part of the status quo and just say what I think should be heard that the city may want to hear, but to say and have a voice for the people in this community, and to honestly say what the people in this community feel and may think or may have experienced in the city of High Point in a more honest, real talk kind of way.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Tolliver?
Good evening, everybody. So the reason why I joined the commission really is just to be a part of change here in the city of High Point. I've been here for 15 years, and just be part of something that's bigger than who I am.
Thank you. Commissioner Williamson?
Yes. As a resident of High Point, this is the longest I have ever been in one place at one time. It's coming up on 13 years in August. And I just thought that it's time for me to establish a foothold in my community and just give something back to the community that was so open to let me lay down roots here. So.
All right, and thank you very much. Councilman Johnson?
I'll be brief. Mine is basically the reason that I definitely wanted to be a part of this is change. Change requires movement. In order for us to create the single most livable, safe, and prosperous community in America for all people, period.
Thank you very much. And finally, Chair Austin.
Well, I can simply say ditto to everything that's been said before me. I grew up in rural North Carolina during segregation and lived through a lot of the disparities that we are now studying. I've been in High Point for 40 years, and during this 40 years, I've been boots on the ground in the communities and witnessed what's going on there. I am a firm believer that you can only make change from within. And over the years, we've worked hard, and I say we because there are many of us that have been working in this community, have worked hard to get to a point where we can actually affect change. And now we have the opportunity. So we're taking the opportunity and we're running with it. And another thing that I always say is, and we don't want this sitting on somebody's shelf, you know, collecting dust after we've completed our work.
Thank you very much. I want to personally thank each of you for sharing, and I appreciate the passion in the statements that you all have made. And so at this point, I'm going to turn this back over to you, Chair Austin, to talk about the subject matter experts' presentations, and that afterwards, I will introduce each of the subject matter presenters, and we'll hear from them.
Thank you. And yes, I've asked WPR to facilitate the subject matter experts' presentations. But before we do that, I just wanted to remind us that in October, during our retreat, we voted as a commission on policy proposal focus areas based on the resolution. Up to this time, we've brought in our subject matter experts. We've created work group tasks that were assigned to each commissioners, and we've moved forward with those tasks. Our focus is restorative economic policy, and some of the ideas that will come out of this venture will hit on the resolution, but also outside of it. One of the conversations that we continue to have is, this is just the beginning. And the information that comes out of this process, we hope to, and I say we, because I know many of our commissioners and others will be working on this project as we move forward. But we can use this information for future use. Having said that, I am going to turn it back over to WPR.
Okay, tag, I am it. Thank you, sir. So you all may recall that the commission was sent a questionnaire at the request of Chairman Alston. These questions will in fact be considered by the subject matter experts as they complete the report for the commission's approval later on down the road. I want to thank those commissioners who actually responded to the questionnaire. Your information has been received, and it will in fact be shared with the subject matter experts. And so, and I want to apologize. Earlier, I had said that we would have the subject matter experts started at 6:45. I forgot that we started 10 minutes late, so we're going to have them to start now. It's about 6:55, which should be okay. So the order of presentation will be Dr. Sills, then Dr. Ringel, Dr. Summy, and Dr. Ali. And if each of you wish to give further introductions when you speak, you may feel free to do so. And the way that we've asked the commissioners to be timely, we would ask that you all also be timely, because we do have a tight schedule tonight. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm Stephen Sills. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Research Policy and Impact Center at the National Institute of Minority Economic Development. Before that, I was a professor of sociology at UNC Greensboro. In these two roles, I've conducted 17 different studies of High Point and Guilford County, including High Point. And tonight, we're going to be focusing on a few of those studies and their findings. I'll be presenting to you data in infographic formats, in informational manner, with mapping and other ways of understanding what we see in the community in terms of racial disparities around health equity, housing equity, economic development. Maybe. We'll just hit next. We'll begin with the market segmentation report that was conducted in 2015 and 2016 for the city of High Point. This study looked at the core city of High Point, neighborhood by neighborhood, parcel by parcel, each piece of land. We tallied 15,800 homes that we looked at from roof to foundation, and we matched this information with all data that we could that was available. There were more than 70 different social, demographic, market, and community variables that we compiled at the block group level. This is a little larger than the neighborhood. And 20-plus variables about the structures and the land within the core city. You can see from this graphic kind of the way in which parcels fit inside block groups, inside census tracts, inside the city, and inside the county. And these were all sources of data. From that information, we created a map. This map shows neighborhoods that were stable in terms of market forces, social forces, crime, health, and other indicators. Other neighborhoods, lighter green, were functioning. yellow, constrained, orange, weak, and red, extremely weak. You're going to see throughout the rest of this presentation that those neighborhoods identified as extremely weak continue to be extremely weak in all forms of data, whether we're looking at poverty, median income, household status, educational attainment. All of those neighborhoods that were identified as being extremely weak have a consistent thread that links them together. The racialized planning of the 1800s and 1900s that influenced the development of those communities. We proposed to the city, based on this data, certain ways of addressing each of these neighborhoods. Tactical code enforcement for those that are stable neighborhoods, neighborhood action plans for functioning, asset-based micro plans or community asset building plans, property acquisition in areas that were weak in market terms, blight elimination, and redevelopment. Since this report, and since the work with the Center for Community Progress that followed, many of these plans have been set into motion, working with Habitat, working with city housing development, targeting those neighborhoods that are red and orange in those maps for as much influence, as much investment as possible. The next report is from the Foundation for a Healthy High Point. You'll see several Healthy High Point references throughout the rest of the presentation. This was the 2017 Health Report Card. We're focused on the social determinants of health, economics, social well-being, educational opportunity, and how they impact health outcomes, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, that result from having negative forces within a neighborhood. Again, we assembled over 70 variables. We workshopped it with community organizations, with the board of directors of the the Foundation for Healthy High Point, and we boiled it down to 15 key indicators, and you'll see that they go from red to green. Green were indicators that were better than the median or average for Guilford County or the state of North Carolina. So we see that there are 3 indicators that High Point was doing better on, but red were the areas where they were doing much worse than would be expected. Some of those areas are, again, once mapped, those same core city areas that were red in the previous map. Take, for instance, infant mortality. The infant mortality rate in neighborhoods in the core city, that dark blue on the left side of the map, was much higher than the rest of the average for the city. 11.2 deaths in High Point annually at the time of this report. That number has since come down, though low weight babies has gone up in the interim. That means more infants are surviving to being born, but still being born at lower weights. The map on the right is low income, low food access, what people commonly refer to as food deserts. We know that there's a high correlation between poor nutrition available in these red areas and diabetes averages, which are much higher than would be expected in the green areas. We compiled all of that information into an interactive map. You can go to that URL, tinyurl.com, Healthy High Point, and it'll take you to an interactive map where you can see each of these variables laid out on the geography of High Point. And you can also see how rich High Point is in assets that are addressing those issues. Sometimes, however, those assets are not in the location where highest need is located. We'll move now to the 2019 study, Building Resilience in High Point, for what became Resilience High Point. This study was commissioned to engage the public in focus groups and conversations and interviews, collecting surveys from community members to really understand from High Point residents' perspectives what's going on in their communities and what are their issues. I've matched some of the data from our secondary data, the mapping data, with some of the quotes from the interviews. Here one says, I feel as though High Point is a very segmented community. There are very few spaces that both the wealthy citizens and the struggling citizens can meet and build relationships. This was from a focus group participant. You can see that laid out when we map the city by race. White neighborhoods, highly concentrated in the west and north, African American in the core city, and Hispanic in the southern portion of the city. Two more quotes. The first from a member of the community in the north part of High Point. I live in the North High Point. Most of your questions don't apply to me. The real issue is that most of North High Point live in a cocoon. Consciously or unconsciously, they ignore the issues that plague other citizens in our city. They get services and resources to everyone. We need true community spirit. We don't have community spirit. We're a city divided mostly by race. On the right, we see a quote from a member of the community in the core city, in the south of High Point. I'm appalled that citizens on my end of the city only has jobs that pay bare minimum, while areas starting at HPU are developing and bringing in new businesses and pouring money into those areas. Our children are attending schools that are less than efficient and don't equally embrace the educational value that should be given to all kids. The total disregard for this community is a shame, and the city of High Point really doesn't care about this part of town. However, we are a diverse community of seniors and young families that are praying anyone, will speak to us about the inequalities we're experiencing daily. I think when you juxtapose these two individuals, you really see that segmented and divided city. Transportation cannot be ignored. It is an issue that has come up in every single interview, focus group, survey, and report that I've done with the city. In our survey of residents, 11.3 said they walk. They don't have cars, they don't have transportation, mass transit doesn't run when they need to, so they walk. 8.4% said they only have a bus to rely on. 5.4% said they rely on rides with friends. We see in this map that there are neighborhoods where 20 and even 30 or 40% of households do not have a car. And so transportation becomes a barrier to educational opportunity, good jobs, food access, healthcare access, and other resources. These two quotes, I won't read them, but they both talk from the service provider perspective and a job seeker's perspective about that issue, transportation being hard to come by if you're without a car. What is the result of the combination of all of these social determinants of health? Life expectancy differences of 17 to 20 years difference between the core city, where the average life expectancy is 68, and the north, where average life expectancy is 85 years or more. That difference is attributable to these social differences in investment in community resources. From this report, there were 5 key recommendations that came from the community. Address our community violence issues, provide safe, affordable housing, give us access to food, healthcare, and jobs, provide childcare, and treat substance use. Finally, in 2022, I completed a second round of assessments of social drivers of health in High Point for the Foundation for a Healthy High Point. Again, speaking with organizational leaders, community stakeholders, residents, in focus groups, interviews, surveys throughout the community. Self-reported health disparities are quite clear. In light blue, you see non-white. In dark blue, you see white respondents to our survey. 35% of non-white respondents said they have trouble getting affordable medications, while only 21% of white respondents see that as an issue. This next one is quite drastic difference. 28.8% of non-white respondents said that they have difficulty with having clinics or doctors close to them or with an easy transportation distance, while only 4.8% of white respondents saw that as an issue. These disparities in access to health care, in self-reported health issues, really are quite dramatic and the results of disparities in the structure of the city. We compiled all of the data from this study, again, into, similar to the market segmentation study, a health equity score, looking at life expectancy, disease, preventative medication, and healthcare, all of the different positive and negative factors. And again, we see that areas of the core city are low in health equity as a result. There were a set of community-recommended solutions. Top of the list was increasing availability of safe and affordable housing. Second, providing more health insurance coverage to those who are underinsured or uninsured. And finally, increasing the availability of healthy foods in neighborhoods that are food deserts. We're currently engaged in a process working with the YWCA to complete a racial equity scorecard. This will be a visual dashboard, if you want, that looks at the different disparity datas that we've compiled. Here's an example of some of that information. This is looking at arrest rates by race. We see a disparate arrest rate within the FBI uniform crime statistics for the city. Is this the result of over-policing? Is this the result of crime in neighborhoods that are related to property crime or substance use? This needs to be teased out further. Home ownership rates are quite dramatically different. 66.8% of white households own their home, while 37% of black households do. This 30% difference is attributable to many factors, from banking to residential segregation, to access to credit, etc. We see wage disparities are quite dramatic. Those green bars are white families, the blue bars are black families, and we see that when you plot that out, the median household incomes are about $30,000 difference. Here it is again in another form, one being wages, one being household income. Access to financial services, as we said, may be one of the attributable factors or causal factors for the difference in home ownership. This is mortgage approval data from the banking sector, and you see that white respondents, white mortgage applicants, have a much higher rate of acceptance or approval for a loan versus black applicants. I've done a series of studies controlling for income, controlling for neighborhood, controlling for value of the home, loan-to-value ratios, every control factor you can. And we see that in Guilford County, an African-American male is 25% less likely to be approved for a loan than a white male, all other things being equal. School suspensions and expulsion rates are disproportionately impacting black and Hispanic youth. Here we see access to transportation is clearly tied to race as well. Black respondents in this survey were 11% did not have access to reliable transportation versus 4% of Asian Americans and 4% of white. Access to health care. This is an area where we've begun to see gains. Those blue bars are larger than the green bars now. Why is that? Affordable Care Act was instituted, and we've begun to see that more African American community members are beginning to have access to health care through the ACA. I think this is one of the most striking maps. When we map race and ethnicity, we see just how segregated some neighborhoods are. On the left, the blue, 90% white. These households in these neighborhoods, 90% of the households are white, while in the red areas on the right, 90% are black. This is a segregated city in many ways. Happy to answer any questions or pass on to the next subject matter expert.
We'll go to the next expert.
Certainly.
We'll see if we have time at the end. If you would save your questions, please, we'll ask questions all at one time. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. And I may just do it, yeah, I may just go it this way too. So I'm Dr. Paul Ringel. I am a professor of history at High Point University, and my approach is going to be a little different from Dr. Sills in a couple of ways. First of all, while I have been working on the history of this city for about a decade in my research, the last couple months is the first time that I've had access to the records that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So I've really been trying to cram in as much as I can. Part of the reason for that is that these records weren't available. It took me about 3 years. They were buried in the state archives in Raleigh, and nobody in High Point had access to them. So it took me years to get my hands on the data. But I have been working feverishly on this material for the last couple of months, and I want to give you kind of a work in progress on what I've got for you today. Today I'm going to talk about 1897 to 1930. 1897 because that's when the High Point public school system started. 1930 because that's just where I happened to finish this morning. So there's no significance to the later date. Just before I dig into some of the data a little bit, and because I was spending so much time, I really wanted to get as much to you as possible. My PowerPoint's much simpler, and it's not, but I wanted to get some of this data to you, and I want to give you first a big picture of what I think, what I've seen my role as being, and if you have questions or comments for that at the end, we can talk about it. But what I've been really trying to do for you is quantify as much of the data on education as I could. We all know there was discrimination, there were racial disparities in the High Point education system. That's not going to be any news to anybody. But what I've been really trying to do is give you specific numbers as much as I can so that you can then have those numbers as you make your policy choices. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be showing you today is how I'm trying to lay out some of this material for you. And if we have time at the very end, I'm happy to take questions or take questions from people afterwards. Okay, so I started in 1897, which is the year that the High Point Public Schools were founded by a piece of legislation. At that time, approximately 30% of the population of High Point was black, and there were no public schools for black children in this city. Some of you may know that the High Point Normal and Industrial School, which later became William Penn, was founded here in the early 1890s by the New York Friends meeting, but that was a private school. And I've been trying to figure out exactly what I would almost call it quasi-private, because there was some funding coming from the school board later on, not in 1897, but later on for William Penn. I've had a hard time figuring out exactly what that was, but there was no fully publicly supported school for black children here when the school system was founded in 1897. So through the legislation that was passed in March of that year, the city received a $10,000 bond that's a mistake, sorry, bond to start public schools, not from black voters. But the city received a $10,000 bond to start public schools. $6,500 of that was spent on the Cox estate. J. Elwood Cox was the chair of the school board. Now, I am not entirely clear whether that was, he was selling that to make financial gain from this transaction, or whether he was doing this as a partially philanthropic effort. That's pretty much impossible to tell from the records, but $6,500 of the $10,000 went to buying the Cox estate, which became the site of the first public school in High Point. That was the South Main Street School. One of the things that I discovered, I guess I can't say I was surprised, but I was surprised to see it so starkly laid out, was that through this legislation in 1897, part of this $10,000 bond came from the raising of poll taxes. And for those of you who don't know, poll taxes were a strategy used by the people in power to keep poor people and most of the black people in the city from voting. So the very funding of the original public schools came at least in part from the poll taxes that were restricting black people from voting. One of the things that struck me as I was looking at the early documents, During the early years in 1897, 1898, the city was paying part of the salaries for the black teachers at the High Point Normal and Industrial School. And what was striking at that point was that the salaries were relatively equal. In fact, the salaries of the principal at the High Point Normal and Industrial was the same as the salary of the principal at South Main Street. I say that's striking because, as we will see, that does not continue. And I think that's part of, I don't want to go too deeply into a broader argument here, but I do want to say briefly that that sort of tracks with larger trends that we're seeing in the establishment of Jim Crow, that the Jim Crow systems were established in the 1890s, but it took a while for those systems to be fully established. And we often don't see the full establishment, especially once you get out of the Deep South into places like North Carolina and Virginia. You don't fully see the implementation of those policies until the teens or the 20s. So one of the things we see in 1897 is that the black and white teachers' salaries are the same, but that's going to change. From 1899 to 1919, the records are very sparse. And part of the reason for that, the records that I was finally able to get from Raleigh don't start until 1919. So I've been able to pull some material from the city council records. I've been able to pull some material from Glenn Chavis's work. I've been able to pull some material from a book that was written on the history of the High Point schools. But I don't have nearly as much material from before 1919 as I do afterwards. What I can tell you from this time period is that after South Main Street School was started in 1897, there were 3 more schools for white students started before there were any schools started for black students. So in 1905, they started the Elm Street School. In 1910, they started the Park Street School. And in 1911, they started the 3rd Ward School. So by 1915 in the city council records, they're the school that becomes known as, that is known at the time as the South High Point Colored School. That's later going to become Fairview. So for those of you who are local folks and know about the Fairview School, that is the school that is going to subsequently in the 20s be renamed as Fairview. So that school was owned by the city according to city council records in 1915. But it was still partially subsidized by the New York Friends. So one of the things that I've learned is that New York Friends didn't just subsidize High Point Normal and Industrial, which we already knew. They also subsidized Fairview for at least a while. Now, they didn't pay everything, but they were paying some of the salaries for the teachers. And I wasn't able to figure out at Fairview, at least, how much of the building and the materials that High Point Normal and Industrial was subsidizing. So in 1919, we start getting the full records. And so here's where I can start giving you more specific details. I told you in 1897, the salaries were the same. By 1919, that's no longer true. So in 1919, 1920, just for reference, because these numbers only mean anything in comparison, right? So for reference, the superintendent of the High Point schools in 1919, 1920 received a $2,100 salary for the year. So that gives you a little bit of a reference. The other teachers and principals were paid by the month. The principal at South Main School was paid $187.50 a month. The principal at Fairview was paid $75 a month, so less than half. The white teachers were paid in a range between $110 and $70 a month. The black teachers at Fairview, now this does not count High Point Normal and Industrial. These are only the teachers at Fairview that I have this data for. So the black teachers were paid $60 a month. And I think I told you all this detail last month. This was one of the first details that I saw that really jumped out at me. The white janitors that were hired to work at the white schools in 1919 were paid the same amount as the principal was at Fairview. In 1920, they evaluated the value of the buildings and the materials at the respective schools. I didn't give you the entire list. I figured this would be enough. South Main was the school that had the most value in terms of the materials and the value of the building at $12,000. It was significantly more than any other school. The Elm Street School was second at $4,000, and that's why I put it there, just to give you some reference. And then Fairview was valued as the least valuable school in the system at $1,200. In 1920, the board spent $738.92 on repairs at white schools and $18.87 on repairs at black schools. They spent $1,489.26 for the furniture at the white schools and $798.09 for the furniture at the black schools. So not as wide a disparity as the repairs, but still only about half. In March of 1920, Principal Ossie Davis, who was the principal at Fairview, and 200 other African-American citizens petitioned the board for better accommodations and facilities at what they called their very much overcrowded school. At the next meeting, the chair of the board acknowledged a need to, quote, equalize the facilities between the two races. There was a letter from the lawyers of the board at the time that said that it was pretty clear that the school board was not living up to the requirements of separate but equal that were established under the original system. And so, in fact, there was a question about whether the board was doing the work it was supposed to be doing under the 1897 law. So in 1920, we see the very members of the school board openly and publicly acknowledging that they're probably not doing what they need to be doing to do right by the black students and the black teachers in this school, in this city. Just to give you, I'm going to skip, for the 1920s, there are three schools for black students in High Point. One is Fairview, which was already started. In 1921, they opened a second elementary school, which was the Leonard Street School. Many of you are going to have heard of that. And then in 1923, the High Point Normal and Industrial School is sold, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is sold to the city, and so that becomes the public high school that later in the decade is going to become known as William Penn. That name was changed to honor the Quaker roots of the school sometime around 1925 or 26. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of information about each of the schools. So in 1919, they decided they were going to expand the Fairview School, and the board required the students to paint the addition themselves without receiving any compensation. I have not been able to find any white equivalent of that where the board asked the white students to perform that kind of labor on their own schools. In 1928, when the teachers at Fairview came to the board and asked for a fence to surround the property, the board agreed to pay for half of it. That same year, when the faculty at Emma Blair came to the board and asked for a fence, they paid for it without restrictions. Leonard Street, as I said, was opened in 1921 as the second black elementary school. In 1928, they announced the need for an expansion to add 3 classrooms on to this crowded school. By the next year, and as I said, I'm only at this point up to 1930, so presumably sometime in the early 30s, they're going to go back and they're going to do the expansion. But by the next year, they still hadn't done anything, even though they said they were going to do something. In the meantime, they completed the school that was going to be High Point Central at the cost of $500,000. And then William Penn was sold. HPNI is my acronym for High Point Normal and Industrial because it gets too tiring to type that out over and over again. It was sold to the city in 1923 with the limitation that the land had to always be used as a site for quote-unquote Negro education. That requirement was later removed, but in the 20s and 30s, that was part of the requirement that the city board had to use that property. One of the things that's interesting, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, But I do want to jump to the next slide pretty quickly. There was a conflict over some of the materials left behind. The Quakers, when they sold the school, they left some of the materials, the piano, some of the furniture, to A.J. Griffin, who had been the principal, and that's the namesake of Penn Griffin. He had been the principal of High Point Normal and Industrial for over a decade, and he had been living on campus, and they didn't want to kick the man out of his house, so they gave him the house that was standing on the property, and they gave him some of the furniture and the piano, and the Board of Education complained about that donation that they gave to Principal Griffin, saying that because of that donation, the William Penn was not going to be able to be accredited by the North Carolina, I don't remember exactly what the, no, I didn't put it here. The North Carolina organization that was regulating the black schools. They called it something like the North Carolina Foundation for Negro Schools. The board was claiming that they weren't going to be able to get accredited because the Quakers had given these pieces of furniture to Principal Griffin. This is a letter, I'm quoting pretty extensively because I found it very striking, from the lawyer, the New York lawyer, who was representing the New York Friends to the board. And he says, I've read your letter carefully and confess that I'm inclined to smile at the complaint which is made. For as I remember, the pianos, library equipment, et cetera, the whole business was so meager and worn out that a very few dollars would cover the value of the whole outfit. It seems to me that the educational department of High Point is trying to magnify a very small matter into an excuse for doing nothing. It was certainly the expectation of the trustees of New York Yearly Meeting when High Point accepted their offer of the grounds and buildings that High Point would equip them in a proper manner to carry on the work of the school and not rely on the old worn-out stuff that was all New York Yearly Meeting had to turn over. So obviously there's bias here from the lawyer. He doesn't want to look bad, but I thought it was noteworthy that this white man up north was saying, all right, you're clearly trying to get out of your responsibilities here. And you're clearly trying to not even put in the minimum amount of financial support to the black schools. We've given you the grounds, we've given you the building. They decided at the time when the school was handed over, they decided that they were going to discontinue the boarding school, which they had been running there because it was too expensive to run, despite the fact that the black community asked them to keep it going and even tried to raise funds to continue keeping the boarding school going. They decided not to do that, and it seems pretty clear that they're trying to basically get away with paying as little as they can. I wanted to just give you, I think I'm pretty close to done here. Yeah, okay, I'm pretty close. Am I doing okay on time?
You're getting there.
Okay, I'll be quick. I don't need to go through all of these things, but these resources here are 4 examples where the white schools got materials that the black schools didn't get. And so people have told me over and over again, as I've talked to people who were alums of William Penn, they talked about how they got the hand-me-down books and that they never got the good lab equipment and things like that. I haven't been able to document that as much in the records as I was hoping, but what I have been able to find is over and over and over again, there are times when they give piano or resources for a student newspaper or band instruments to the white schools and don't do the same for the black schools. And then lastly, and I can leave this just for you to look at because I wanted to give you the end date where I was at 1928. There are the salaries. The William Penn principal's salary didn't increase at all over the decade. The white principal's salary went from $3,000 to $4,740. Across the board, the salaries are lower for white teachers, for black teachers than white teachers, black principals for white than white principals. And the last point I want to make here is that they have a junior high school principal who's receiving $2,700. There is no junior high school for the black students, and that's going to be true for quite a while until Griffin opens, I think sometime in the 40s or 50s. So that's where I am at this point. I will, obviously keep going and talk about desegregation and all of that, but I wanted to give you a work in progress there.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Ringgold, and we will now hear from Dr. Summey.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Virginia Summey. I'm a independent historian and consultant. And in many ways, you'll find my presentation kind of a precursor to what Dr. Sills was talking about. A lot of it is how we got to where we are right now. And I start my research in the 1960s going through city council records. So one of the microfilm machines at the public library and I have become very good friends. But in the process of going through these city council records, I've identified a few actions taken by the High Point City Council, particularly in the 1960s, particularly that address the issues that were facing High Point's Black community at the time. The first and the biggest was in 1960, High Point officially embarked on its first urban renewal project. This was a part of something that was going on across the country at the time. Many cities across the country embarked on urban renewal projects, particularly in the Northeast. The federal government paid 2/3 of the project. And the first area that the city of High Point focused on was the East Central District. And so I have two maps there. One, the bigger map is a 1960 map of High Point, which I understand is probably a little hard to see. The second is the areas in black, or the particular areas of focus by the Urban Renewal Committee in the 1960s. You'll see it is, bordered by English Street, Green, and of course, several of the street names I have found have changed since then. But this is largely the area that of focus. In this period of the city, city planners described one dwelling in this area as, quote, smaller than 2 spaces at a supermarket with no running water or bathroom, serving a residence for 8 to 10 people at one time. Most of the areas of this urban renewal district were up to 72% black. And so in 1962, the urban renewal plan for the East Central area outlined its plans for the neighborhood. There were acquisition and clearance of dilapidated structures, redevelopment of cleared area for private and public use, rebuilding and construction of street, sidewalks, and utilities, provision and development of community facilities, and rehabilitation of salvable structures. Like I said, High Point's urban renewal, like many other cities across the country, primarily affected its black citizens. The method typically used to eliminate these quote-unquote slums was to essentially raze entire neighborhoods. There is one picture from the High Point Enterprise where they were even intentionally setting fires to people's homes to have the High Point Fire Department practice on these homes as a way of essentially demolishing these people's neighborhoods. Nationally, these projects were so synonymous with the removal of black citizens that most urban renewal projects were dubbed quote-unquote Negro removal programs. In 1964, the High Point Human Relations Commission addressed the issue particularly of housing, because when these neighborhoods, when the homes were being destroyed, they were left with few places to go. So they embark on a series of building housing projects by the city. By 1964, High Point was home to 2 public housing units, the Daniel Brook Homes, which were built for black residents, and the Clara Cox Homes, which were built for white residents. Both were built in 1942. But after this project, or a part of this project, the city built the Astor Dowdy Towers, Carson Stout Homes, and Cedar Street Homes in 1966 Spring Valley Apartments in 1967, and Beeman Courts in 1974. As I said, all of these units were built to help alleviate the displacement caused by the East Central urban renewal. However, supply could not keep up with demand. By September of 1967, there were 500 applicants hoping for a place in one of the city's new housing projects. At the time, less than half of them would be able to receive a place to live. Daniel Brooks, Alster Dowdy, and Cedar Street homes contained only 276 units for over 500 applicants who were looking for homes after urban renewal. Another problem was that purchasing a home for Black residents was extremely difficult. This was an advertisement that was in the High Point Enterprise, $350 down, a five-room brick home in excellent condition. However, on local and national levels, the real estate market and racist lending practices made it very difficult to be able to purchase a home. Unequal access to home ownership furthered patterns of economic inequality that have enduring legacies today. Additionally, prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, women were also denied mortgage financing that could help them out to achieve the goal of home ownership. Early in the urban renewal process, a letter from the East Central Homeowners Protective Association was submitted to the High Point City Council, saying, quote, "If we could afford it, we would remain silent, but we are too poor, too advanced in years, and too proud of our achievement in becoming homeowners to give up our homes without a struggle," unquote. The response from the city was that no homeowner has been offered less than fair market price for their home as established by the Redevelopment Commission and approved by the federal government. However, fair market price for these homes in the East Central Urban Renewal District came nowhere near what it would cost to buy a new home. Even in public housing, many of the displaced by the urban renewal program found themselves ineligible for public housing. In 1969, 2 years after the completion of Spring Valley Apartments, 31 of the 78 dwellings were vacant, as 4 out of every 5 applicants failed to qualify for 3 reasons. They made too little money, they made too much money, or they had poor credit. So even the solutions to the problems did not really address the problem. Overall, between 1962 and 1970, $23 million in federal funds were spent on the East Central urban renewal area. As I said, these programs did not alleviate crucial problems still existing in the areas intended to improve the quality of life. Housing became the primary point of contention, but also access to quality education, continued crime, and poor health outcomes. In July of 1986, 26 years after the city of High Point began its first urban renewal program in the East Central District, the city adopted the East Central Small Area Plan. In its introduction, it states that, quote, "Since the early 1970s, East Central has shown a steady decline in both housing conditions and the general appearance of the neighborhood. At the time, 73% of the dwellings in East Central were rental units. 66 were built before 1950. 14% of those were deemed dilapidated. The study stated that between 1982 and 1985, there had been little new construction, with only 6 new single-family units erected. It also cited limited commercial shopping options, which was not addressed by the 1960s era project. In short, during the 1960s, the city of High Point attempted to revitalize an area, left residents with few, if any, better housing options, and essentially walked away. Another project that the city of High Point embarked on with the federal government was the Model Cities program. Oh, this is the, I'm sorry, I forgot to change my slide. That is the area in question from the 1986 study, which is essentially the same area from the 1960s study. From 1968 to 1974, the city of High Point was one of 150 cities nationwide that participated in the federal Model Cities program. The Model Cities program was a part of President Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty. The onslaught of urban renewal projects in the post-war area, and as I've highlighted, their significant shortcomings, led to the creation of model cities, which aim to improve relations between communities and municipal governments. It emphasized social projects that were unique to each city. In High Point, Dr. Otis E. Tillman was the chairman of the Model Cities Project, which was unique because he was an African-American leader in the community. The prior urban renewal projects had very limited, if any, Black input. The implementation of model cities revolved around demonstrations, what they called demonstrations and citizen participation that aimed to break cycles of poverty. So they started a consumer credit counseling program. They started a tutoring program. They started daycares for the city. And it focused on aiming about 21% of the city's population. They also put out a monthly newspaper. There is about 19 issues of what's happening, model cities, and then talking about what the Model Cities program is doing. However, according to the black and yellow report you see there, which was the final report of the Model Cities program, the program failed in making a significant impact on lack of adequate housing and underemployment. That outcome with model cities, however, was not unique to High Point. As one professor concludes in her analysis of the Model Cities program in Seattle, even though the Great Society ethos sought to undermine the conditions of racial and economic disenfranchisement, model cities recreated this disenfranchisement by not allowing state institutions to be reformed or reconsidered. So basically, they go in and they do a lot of feel-good, do-good works, and didn't change the basic structures of inequality that were causing the problems to begin with. In 1963, so High Point actually, they tried a few different things. They tried quite a few different things. In 1963, the city of High Point approved the establishment of a biracial committee, joining other cities such as Charlotte, Winston-Salem, and Durham in exploring solutions to ease racial tension in the city. High Point was not without its episodic violence during the civil rights movement, particularly in the form of marches. One particular, I believe in 1968, as much as 300 African Americans were arrested in one night in High Point. But part of the goal of this biracial committee was to end civil rights demonstrations in the area. The committee worked with local businesses regarding desegregation, persuading hotels, motels, and eating establishments to serve all people, regardless of race. The initial report of the biracial committee, however, was not received with praise from High Point's Black community. While white leaders pointed to integrated park facilities and schools, the local chapter of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, stated that not enough progress had been made to end demonstrations. CORE cited that no progress had been made regarding desegregation at the local YMCA, bowling alleys, High Point Memorial Hospital, theaters, and most importantly, again, in housing. The Black attorney for the biracial committee, John Langford, praised the progress of the praised the progress of the committee. However, the local chapters of CORE and the NAACP called for his removal from the committee in favor of someone who, quote, knows and will bespeak the attitudes of the Negro people, unquote, in High Point. And so after the biracial committee lasted less than a year, it was disbanded in September of 1963 with a permanent human relations committee taking its place. So it was there for a few months and it was there for a few months. Finally, in March of 1981, the city of High Point began a revitalization project of the Washington Street area community, allotting $155,000 in community block development grant funds from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The funding was used to create a revolving loan fund for commercial development. And unlike the urban renewal attempts of the early and mid-1960s, one of the goals of the project was to enable community members to be a part of the process. The area faced several problems, including crime, lack of commercial activity and jobs, as well as physical deterioration. In 2010, the Washington Street Historic District was added to the National Register of Historic Places, although I have not found any follow-ups to that 1981 study and what in fact was actually done. And so that is where I currently am in my research as to what particular actions the City of High Point, particularly the High Point City Council, has taken since 1960 as far as addressing problems unique to, or problems not unique, but in particular to East Central and High Point's Black community.
All right, thank you, Dr. Summy, and we will now hear from Dr. Ali. Before Dr. Ali comes up, I do want to acknowledge our project manager, Leah Henry. She has worked really hard in helping to coordinate the subject matter experts being here tonight and pulling some of the research together that they have shared with you. I also want to let you all know that the chairman is not feeling well and he has left, and that Commissioner McMichael will preside in his stead for the rest of the meeting. So Dr. Ali, would you please? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I'm here with Research Assistant Ali Beatty. Thank you, Commissioners, for your time and your attention. This is a very important matter that we're engaging in. I just want to say that it's an honor to serve in this capacity as one of your content experts. So thank you for this opportunity. What we want to do is, very briefly, because we want to give as much time for questions, there isn't that much time left, just to share that I'm working with Allison and Kayla Dollard on reaching out to the community to gather oral histories. I'm a historian, I'm a professor and a dean at UNC Greensboro, and I work in the African American Studies program. And what we're trying to do is add to the body of work that historians have done to go back to all the way the colonial period to the present. My colleagues here have filled in many of the specific details in the contemporary times. What we're trying to do is put a little bit of a human face, if you will, on these stories. So what we've done is basically, what we're trying to do is capture 3 different areas: oral histories from the Penn Collection, which is thanks to High Point University's faculty and students, oral histories from the community, oral histories of you, the commissioners, and to a broader historical narrative for a final report. So the William Penn Oral History Collection has been mentioned, several dozen interviews conducted and archived through High Point University based on high school graduates here. Oral history from the community. These are individual members of the community who we are reaching through local contacts, family, co-workers in the city. And oral history of you, yourselves, commissioners, especially what we're interested in is those of you who worked in the city, lived, studied in the city during the era of Jim Crow, to get your experiences, to capture that. We wanted to just read very briefly a few of the quotes that we're starting to gather and identify, just to give a flavor. So I'll ask Ali if you don't mind doing the first one.
There were some people who just did not have or could not do what they have been done, what should have been done. And the teachers and the parents who could have helped those kids. And it's just a different day then. People cared. Miss Peggy Allen.
So what we're going to see is just this community spirit of supporting people in the community, elders supporting young people throughout that process. I'll just read the next one, and it just seemed to be at that time, and anybody of color could be a target for any given reason or no reason anywhere. This is Mary Lou Blakely. If you want to read the next one.
And this is Jerry Camp. I attended a couple of meetings when the Black Panther Party came to town. My sister, she marched in the earlier years, and she was a couple of years older than me, and I guess when all of the movement started, I was maybe 13, and my mother shouldn't have allowed me to take part in it. When you knew, she did, and she felt, she felt what was best, and that was the shield for her children from getting hurt, getting killed. My sister, she did march, and she did go to jail.
Part of what we want to do in this history is really also talk about the efforts to push back against the discrimination in Jim Crow era. Final one, see, when you have your heritage, you can always come back to it. When you grow up in your heritage, then you go out and learn what's going on in someone else's heritage. So it's really important that we are grounded in this history, and I think there was a commissioner all the way over there, I forget your name, ma'am, who was saying that, the interests of the community at large, with the voices of African Americans really centered in this narrative that we're constructing. So this is what we're going to do is incorporate the oral histories into a new synthesis of existing primary and secondary sources on the history of African Americans in North Carolina and in the city of High Point. And we really are building on a number of giants. Mr. Glenn Chavis was mentioned as one of the key sources. We also have a number of other scholars, just to mention Jeffrey Crow and others, who've done a lot of work in the broader area. So we are building we are standing on the shoulders of other great people there. So thank you very much, just to leave as much time for questions you might have for us. Thank you.
Okay, so at this time, we will allow just a few minutes for questions to any of the subject matter experts. So commissioners, any questions that you all might have of the subject matter experts at this time?
This is Commissioner Riley Wright, and I think my first question would be for Dr. Seals, and that would be, I noticed in your information, you had lots of information, but they're also gathering some information that may be similar to some of the information that you talked about this afternoon with the High Point 2045. Have you had the opportunity to access any of that information?
I have
and
not.
what they're asking people to do when they go out to those meetings?
I have not seen that. High Point 2045, you said?
I believe that's correct, if I said it right.
It is.
Yes.
Oh, the compound, okay. I will definitely dig into that one as well.
Yeah, because I noticed I went to that, and some of those questions that they were asking, some of the information is also not correct. The minimum income in High Point is not house is not $50,000, but just to have another look at that information and what it may look like now.
Certainly. Thank you.
Dr. Sells, while you're still up, this is Commissioner McMichael. I had a question about in the self-reported sample, in the self-reported data, what was the sample size?
That was the 2022 study. It should be around 250 was our response rate on that, response size. 250 individuals.
And then so I know I saw you mention Resilience High Point, and then the race card, was that in relation with the YWCA's race card?
Correct. A current project right now is the YWCA Racial Equity Report Card that's being established with a community advisory committee. Some of the members actually here as well, city staff are involved in that, and that will be coming out in September.
And then, did you have another one? A question for Paul Ringel. How does city policy or county, and this may be county, impact salaries for the Guilford County school system?
Say that again, I'm
How does city policy or county policy impact salaries for the Guilford County school system?
Well, the way that the salaries were set up in the early 20th century is that basically they called it every year they would elect the faculty for the schools for the coming year. And so the school board would set the numbers based on the budgets they were receiving money. Some of the money for the salaries was coming from the county, some of it was coming from the city, and even some of it was coming from the state. So one of the things that, to be fair to the High Point school system, they do seem to be constantly financially strapped. So, for example, I haven't done my report yet, but I have done the research that during the Depression, they required everybody to take salary cuts across the board. And at one point, they were even paying with script that was going to be used at particular stores or, organizations in town. So there is a tie to how much of the budget is available, but the salaries were set by the board, and there does seem to be early on more with the white faculty. Later on, we see it more with the black faculty. There does seem to be some give and take where they say, here's what your salary is going to be, and the faculty member says, no, I'm not going to work for that. I'm going to work for, I want this. And sometimes they win, sometimes they lose, sometimes they come down in the middle. For the most part, I see that with the white teachers early on, but by the time we get to the 50s and 60s, I am seeing some of the black teachers starting to push back on that.
Awesome.
Does that answer the question?
Yes. And then the other statement / question that I have is we know that the research that's been conducted will continue to point towards the disparate treatment of African Americans and marginalized communities. So how do we hold the city accountable for the blatant disregard of African American advancement? I know you look specifically at education, but this has impacted just generational wealth transfer,
Sure.
home ownership, and because at the end, we need to make recommendations. So historically, we know that this has impacted generations, so we'd really like to know what recommendations from a historian perspective you would give for us.
So what I'm trying to do, first of all, is just quantify what those disparities are so that we can see the black teachers were paid 33% or 40% or whatever the numbers are. I'm happy to give you my opinions, my interpretations and my recommendations at the end of the process. But right now, what I felt like my most important job that I could do for y'all was to actively quantify, instead of just saying black teachers got paid less or black schools got less, how much, right? Because if you're going to make these recommendations, if you're going to make these policy recommendations, they have to be based on data. And so what I'm trying to do right now is give you the data. I'm happy to offer my opinions on that at the end of the process, but really what I'm trying to do right now is quantify it so that you have the data to back up your recommendations.
Thank you.
I have a question for Dr. Sills. The comment in reference to mortgage applicants, and you had indicated that you had information relative to Guilford County for black males not being able to, 25% less
Correct.
to be approved. Do you have anything, well, first of all, what year was that from?
Yeah, each year, the Housing Mortgage Disclosure Act releases data through the FFEIC, the federal, I have to look up the acronym, but it's released each year. We're currently going through 2021 data, state of North Carolina and 7 principal cities. The data that I referenced was 2018, 2019, Guilford County, or specifically the Greensboro High Point MSA. The data is listed by census tract, so we can really drill down, and it's also listed by metropolitan statistical area.
Okay, that was going to be my second question.
Yeah.
Are you able to drill down to just High Point area?
Yeah, we can drill down to a neighborhood specifically
Okay.
and see, how much mortgage activity has there been, how racially disparate has it been, how gender disparate has it been. and using what's called logistic regression. That's a way of controlling for all of the variables. We can hypothetically create two equal individuals on all characteristics except for race and see how differently they're treated in the mortgage market.
Okay, great. Thank you. One other question that I have, I'm thinking about the chart that you showed that had the arrest rates for black males and white males. And I wanted to make sure that the population in terms of age did you have a sample size with similar age, or were they younger in age, or
That is
what was that?
Aggregated statistic that's collected by all police, sheriff departments across the country and reported up to the FBI and then released the following year to the public. So it's aggregated data and doesn't disaggregate. I actually have later slides that I didn't show that look just at High Point City's police department's reports, and it gets down into what were people arrested for. You see differences in traffic arrest rates.
Sure.
That seems to be an over-policing problem, perhaps. Everybody speeds. It gets into other categories and locations. You can disaggregate by precinct or district or even the XY coordinates of the police car that was called to the scene. So that information we can delve into as well and disaggregate more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We are right now right at 8 o'clock, so maybe we can get one more question.
Oh, I got several. We had several presentations.
Can I just speak, this is Commissioner Riley, right, to Dr. Summey. So I really don't have a question for you, but I sort of wanted to just comment on the fact that you said something in one of your statements that seems to hold true to what High Point does, and that's presenting, seeing a need or seeing something that is now the thing that's going, and High Point will jump on that need and appear to actually fix a problem and put a Band-Aid on it, and then leave the people in need without their needs being addressed. And that doesn't seem to be something that's new, apparently, very clear. And that, I think, also contributes to the people in the city of High Point feeling disheartened, feeling unheard, and often feeling like every program is just going to be a program, a project, and that's not what the people of High Point are, especially those who are not being served well.
I will say that going through the records, I did notice that there was a significant pattern of that. That there would be these big programs, and that they would the High Point Enterprise would be, very enthusiastically covering, these programs. And of course, the urban renewal program was obviously detrimental to the Black community, but that because of time and resources and just, getting tired, they would walk away.
Well, I think the real issue here is if it's truly important to the city of High Point, and there's truly a concern about the people in High Point, those who are not being served well, then we don't just put it to the side when something else comes along, and that appears to be what the city of High Point has done.
I agree.
So I'll just state my questions for the record. That way you don't have to worry about time for answering them. And it would be just to note that in Dr. Sell's presentation, there were several diagrams that were presented about different neighborhoods, and there was a black box key that talked about areas for redevelopment. And I just wanted to note that all of those areas for redevelopment, which would bring around economic power, jobs, are in marginalized communities, which means property values are low, you buy low, you sell high, and so that these marginalized communities are being used to generate wealth for white folks. And then the next thing that I would just want to state for the record is that when we're doing oral presentations, it would be good so that we can get those stories of individuals that are in High Point now and those who are up in age and really going into those communities that were highlighted in Dr. Sell's presentation to really highlight those stories so that as we continue to do this work, it's inclusive of just many generations of individuals who have had some longevity in the community.
Well, yes, are we still going to receive the staff report? Okay, Chairman Austin had asked staff to share with us an updated presentation about the community engagement process, and so staff will now make that presentation.
Good evening, Commission. Managing Director Jerron Hollis. In light of the information that was shared with you tonight about the oral history, and the acting chair brought out the oral history piece, we want to tie that into what Dr. Ali has presented. And I've asked one of our team members, Kiva Jones, to present kind of where we are and tie in what we're doing with the oral history, the community engagement, and some of the subsequent next steps. I don't think it was stated earlier, but it's also important to keep in mind as far as timeline that the commission will be receiving the draft of the report for consideration in July, and we're voting on it in August. We've started June, so we're getting really, really close. So we're almost at the finish line, but that's just something to keep in mind as we're talking about dates and planning and resources. So I'll turn it over to Kiva Jones. Kiva.
All right, good evening, everyone. Kiva Jones, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Analyst for the City of High Point. And so as Mr. Rashford stated, as Jerron Hollis stated, this was a request from Chair Austin and the One High Point Commission to provide the commission with an update on this project. So the three areas of focus this evening will be the oral history component of the project, community engagement, and timeline of important dates. So just really quickly to review that information, during his presentation, Dr. Ali stated how he and the research assistants are sifting through the narratives that are included in the William Penn Oral History collection and how these narratives may be included in the final report. Additionally, the project manager, Leah Henry, embedded a link to the collection in the slide deck that she shared during last month's meeting, and Ms. Taylor included that presentation in the email she sent you last week. So if you want to explore those narratives, you have the opportunity to do so. Additionally, Dr. Ali talked about including additional interviews that were not included in the William Penn collection that are from the same era, and commissioner interviews. And so with the additional interviews, Project Manager Leah Henry and the research assistants and Dr. Ali are spearheading that project, but we also wanted to try to capture portions of those commissioner interviews in a video production. So we'll share additional information as we work with Dr. Ali and Project Manager Leah Henry to talk about the logistics of that portion of the project. So community engagement. With the limited amount of time that remains, there is a narrow focus on how the community engages in this process. The goal is to encourage people to come to the remaining One High Point Commission meetings and events that focus on the fruits of the Commission's work. In the next few slides, I will discuss how the upcoming meetings will be milestones in this process and include initial details about the community information session. So how do we get the community to engage in these events? So there have been various discussions about approaches to marketing the One High Point Commission events. Marketing Manager Ryan Ferguson and Managing Director Jerron Hollis have presented the city's marketing strategies to the Commission, and in February, those that were present at the One High Point Commission meeting received the hard copy of the flyer that is displayed that was distributed during the MLK Day Parade. So staff is prepared to create similar materials to promote upcoming One High Point Commission events. We have a strong marketing team, and our human relations team has extensive experience in planning and promoting events. The One High Point Commission website is a great resource as well. It includes an events calendar, links to the recordings of previous meetings, and special events like the NAACP Black Agenda Forum. So we can include a QR code on these flyers that easily connects those to the webpage. All right, so timeline. So we have about 15 weeks before the report is presented to City Council. As I shared with you earlier, the upcoming One High Point Commission meetings will be important milestones in this process, many of which are outlined in Section 1.3 of the Subject Matter Experts Guiding Document for Submitting Proposals. This evening, our subject matter experts provided the Commission with an update on their research. The next scheduled One High Point Commission meeting is July 6th, and at that meeting, the subject matter experts will present their complete findings and recommendations to the One High Point Commission. On August 3rd, the Commission will vote on the report, and one of the tasks included on the timeline is presenting the report, findings, and recommendations to the community. There is a community information session planned for August 15th, and additional information about that session will be shared on the next slide. Finally, on September 18th, the findings will be presented to City Council. So the community information session. The purpose of the information session is to inform the public about the One High Point Commission's work and present the report before September 18th. The session is scheduled for Tuesday, August 15th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. at the High Point Theater. The plan is to have a central presentation, information stations based on the recommendations in the report, and a method to capture feedback from attendees. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a flyer that is not an official flyer for the event, but is an exemplar of the digital flyer that our marketing team uses to promote events at the theater. So we can create a similar flyer to promote this event and other significant dates that remain on the calendar. So all of you are pillars in your communities, and we're confident that you will leverage your connections. So this is a moment in history, we all know this. So continue to spread the word in your neighborhoods, your barbershops, beauty salons, community events that you attend. So finding local businesses that have bulletin boards where you can post these flyers and business cards, however we can get the word out, however we can get the community here and involved in these very important dates that remain on the calendar. And as you all know, staff is here to support you with this final push to the finish line. And so if there are any questions, staff is prepared to answer them, or any comments, feedback, please share them.
Commissioner Riley Wright. So when will those things be available for us to start handing out and putting out throughout this community?
Okay, so John.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner.
Yes.
We wanted to, they're ready, they would actually be ready within days. We just wanted, before we started printing them out, we wanted to have this juncture where we kind of got the group up to speed on where we were and what the rollout plan was. So those are readily available. Yeah. Other questions? Kiva, yeah. It might be something I can't answer.
Commissioner Dietz?
Yes, ma'am.
Any plans with the upcoming Juneteenth to start to publicize this upcoming event in August for folks to
Absolutely.
attend?
One of the examples that Kiva gave in the presentation was how we used the MLK parade, and we were able to have handouts. So yes, Juneteenth would be an opportunity to point people in the community to those dates on the timeline. We coming to the commission meeting where it's going to be received, commission meeting where the report will be voted on, the council meeting that's coming up where it will be actually presented to council, and in between those, that August 15th community information session. So those dates that you saw on the timeline, those will be the things that will be reoccurring in the information that goes to the community. And we'll share the dates and information that we had in this presentation. If we haven't already, we'll share that with the commissioners on the distribution list. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman, you need to call for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
I second.
Let's go.
What was that on the?